"You're fired!" My son, whom I helped build an empire, kicked me out, forgetting all my sacrifices. I left quietly, taking one document with me that reveals his dirty secrets. When he found out, he went berserk. Monday is going to be fun. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. The financial reports hit Douglas's glass desk with a soft thud that seemed to echo through his 47th floor office. I watched my son's fingers freeze over his keyboard, shoulders tensing beneath his tailored suit jacket. The afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the minimalist space, highlighting every steel edge and pristine surface. "Douglas, these numbers don't add up. The investors might—" He didn't look up, not immediately. Instead, he continued typing, each keystroke deliberate and dismissive. The city hummed 47 floors below us, muffled by thick glass that sealed us in this sterile monument to modern success. "Dad, you don't understand modern business." His voice cut through the silence as he finally spun his chair around. "Your methods are 20 years outdated." I kept my expression neutral, though something cold settled in my chest. 40 years of building companies, of surviving market crashes and economic uncertainty, reduced to outdated methods by my own son. I straightened the papers, organizing them with practiced precision. "I was building companies when you were still—" "When I was what?" Douglas shot to his feet, his coffee cup clattering against the glass surface. Dark liquid spread across quarterly projections, staining the pristine documents. "When I was a child? Dad, I'm not a child anymore, and I don't need a babysitter." The coffee dripped steadily onto the marble floor. Each drop marked time in this strange, hostile space that used to feel like shared ground. Douglas turned his back to me, hands pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at Lake Michigan's steel-gray waters. "These investor projections show risk factors that could—" "Could what?" He didn't turn around. "Could ruin everything I've built? Could destroy the vision you never understood?" I gathered the coffee-stained papers, my movements deliberately calm. 20 years ago, when Grant FinTech was drowning in debt, Douglas had begged for my help. $20,000 from Eleanor's and my retirement savings had kept this company breathing. Now that same desperate young man stood with his back to me, dismissing decades of experience like yesterday's news. The leverage ratios in these derivatives are perfectly calculated for maximum growth potential. His reflection in the window showed cold determination. "You see risk where I see opportunity. That's the difference between your generation and mine." The silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant hum of Chicago traffic and the steady drip of coffee hitting marble. I folded the stained documents, sliding them into my briefcase with movements that felt ancient, mechanical. Douglas remained at the window, his reflection a stranger in expensive clothes. The young man who once stayed up all night, learning financial modeling from me, had vanished, replaced by this confident executive who saw his father as an obstacle to remove. "I'll review these projections with the compliance team," I said quietly. "Do whatever you think is necessary." His voice carried finality, dismissal wrapped in corporate politeness. I moved toward the door, each step measured and dignified. Behind me, Douglas's reflection watched my retreat in the window's surface. The hallway stretched ahead, leading to elevators that would carry me down to reality, away from this glass tower where my own son had just declared war. The door closed with a whisper-soft click. Douglas never turned around. The conference room door closed with finality behind Douglas, as I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, still processing our argument from 30 minutes earlier. 3 board members shuffled through quarterly reports, their comfortable chatter about market projections creating a familiar corporate backdrop. Something felt different about Douglas's entrance, too purposeful, too calculated. He took his position at the head of the table with deliberate confidence, settling into the leather chair like he was claiming a throne. The afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows caught the cold gleam in his eyes. I shifted uncomfortably, intuition warning me that this routine meeting had transformed into something else entirely. "I've made a decision about management restructuring." Douglas's voice cut through the casual conversation like a blade. "Effective Monday, Columbus Grant will no longer be working with the company." The room fell silent. Margaret Chen, our longest-serving board member, dropped her pen. It clattered against the polished table surface, the only sound in a space suddenly thick with shock. James Morrison's mouth opened slightly, while Patricia Williams stared at Douglas, as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "Douglas, but your father—" Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father will receive appropriate compensation. This is a business decision." The words hit me like physical blows, each syllable precisely chosen for maximum impact. 20 years of sacrifice, of building this company from near bankruptcy to its current success, dismissed as a restructuring decision. The public setting made the humiliation complete. Douglas had chosen this moment, this audience, with surgical precision. I felt every eye in the room on me, watching for my reaction. The corporate setting that had once felt like home now seemed like a courtroom where I'd been sentenced without trial. The wall-mounted screens displaying company metrics suddenly felt like monuments to my obsolescence. Rising slowly from my chair, I maintained the dignity that had carried me through 4 decades of business challenges. The leather creaked softly as I stood, gathering my remaining pride like armor around me. Douglas's calculated cruelty hung in the air, visible to everyone present. "I understand." My voice remained steady, though each word cost me something precious. "Good luck to you, son." Douglas didn't flinch at the title. He sat perfectly still, watching my graceful exit, with the same cold calculation he'd shown entering the room. The board members avoided my gaze, uncomfortable witnesses to a family drama they'd never expected to see played out in their professional sanctuary. The hallway stretched before me as I walked away from 20 years of my life. Behind me, the conference room remained silent. No one spoke in the wake of what they'd witnessed. My footsteps echoed against marble floors, each one carrying me further from the company I'd helped save, toward an uncertain future my own son had thrust upon me. The elevator buttons glowed softly as I pressed the number for my floor. As the doors slid closed, I caught a final glimpse of the conference room where my professional legacy had just been publicly executed. Douglas's silhouette remained motionless at the head of the table, victorious in his corporate coup. My office door closed behind me with a soft click, finally offering the privacy I desperately needed. My hands trembled slightly as I set down my briefcase, the first crack in the composure I'd maintained through Douglas's public execution of my career. The familiar space felt foreign now, as if I were seeing it through different eyes. Cardboard boxes sat stacked in the corner. Someone had anticipated this moment, prepared for my departure before I'd even known it was coming. The efficiency of it struck me like another blow. How long had Douglas been planning this? How many people had known before me? I began mechanically placing personal items into the nearest box. Family photos spanning decades came first. Douglas's graduation from Northwestern, Eleanor and me at our 25th anniversary, the 3 of us at the company's first profitable quarter celebration. Each image told a story of investment, sacrifice, love that had apparently meant nothing to my son. My fingers found a manila folder buried beneath quarterly reports. The documents inside were yellowed with age, financial statements from 2008, when Grant FinTech was hemorrhaging money and facing bankruptcy. I remembered that desperate night when Douglas had called, his voice breaking as he explained how close the company was to collapse. "Dad, I need $20,000. It's our only chance." Eleanor had worried about using our retirement savings, but I'd believed in him. The young man whose passion for financial innovation had impressed even skeptical investors deserved that chance. I'd written the check without hesitation, watching Douglas's relief transform into determination. The phone rang, startling me from the memory. Eleanor's voice carried concern mixed with disbelief. "Columbus, what happened? Mia said there was an emergency board meeting, and now people are whispering." I sank into my chair, staring out at Chicago's streets as evening approached. The words felt like broken glass in my throat. "Eleanor, our son fired me, publicly, in front of everyone." Her sharp intake of breath carried through the phone line. "Oh, my dear, come home. We'll talk this through." 20 years, Eleanor. 20 years I gave to this company. I continued packing with my free hand, wrapping a small bronze award in tissue paper. "Do you remember when I mortgaged our house to cover payroll during the recession? When I worked 16-hour days to rebuild client confidence after the market crash? I remember all of it, she said softly. You saved that company more than once. The documents from 2008 lay spread across my desk like evidence in a case I was only beginning to build. My $20,000 investment had been the bridge Douglas needed to reach bigger investors. My connections, my reputation, my decades of industry relationships had opened doors he couldn't have opened alone. He called it a business decision, I continued, organizing the financial papers with growing purpose. Restructuring, he said, as if 20 years of partnership, of mentorship, could be restructured away like outdated equipment. Come home, Eleanor repeated. We'll figure this out together. As darkness fell over Chicago, I remained in my office, surrounded by boxes that contained the artifacts of a professional lifetime. The betrayal burned in my chest, but beneath the pain, something else was forming, a quiet determination that surprised me with its intensity. The 2008 documents told a story Douglas had apparently forgotten. But I remembered everything, every sacrifice, every risk, every moment when my experience and resources had saved his vision. The game he'd started today would be played by rules he'd never learned. Eleanor's voice faded as I hung up the phone, leaving me alone in the gathering darkness of my office. The warm circle of lamplight felt like the last refuge in a world that had suddenly turned hostile. I reached for the brass switch, flooding my desk with yellow light that made the scattered papers glow like evidence in a courtroom. The manila folder marked 2008 financial crisis, personal, sat buried beneath quarterly reports I'd never see completed. My fingers traced the faded writing, my own handwriting from 17 years ago when desperation had a different face, a younger voice pleading for salvation. Inside, bank withdrawal slips told their own story. $20,000. Our entire savings account drained in a single transaction. Eleanor's reluctant signature appeared beside mine on the withdrawal authorization, her careful script betraying the worries she'd tried to hide during those late-night kitchen conversations. If you don't help me, I'll lose everything. Douglas's voice echoed from memory as I held his original business plan. His desperate annotations covered the margins, calculations, projections, promises written in the shaky handwriting of a man facing financial ruin. The tear stains had long since dried, but I remembered how his voice had broken that night. The loan agreement bore both our signatures, mine, steady and confident despite the risk, his, trembling with gratitude and solemn promises. I'll pay it back with interest. I promise, Dad. The words seemed to pulse beneath the lamplight, each letter a vow he'd apparently forgotten. I stood and walked to the window, holding the document against the glass. Downtown Chicago sprawled below, its lights twinkling like stars in an urban constellation. Somewhere in this maze of ambition and steel, my son was probably celebrating his corporate coup, toasting his independence with colleagues who had no idea how that independence had been purchased. You promised, Douglas. The words escaped in a whisper that fogged the window. You promised everything. Back at my desk, I arranged the documents with methodical precision. Bank records, loan agreements, business plans, evidence of a father's faith in his son's potential, evidence of sacrifices made willingly, investments in a future we'd planned to share. The handwritten notes in Douglas's youthful script mocked me now. Their earnest gratitude transformed into bitter irony. My hands trembled slightly as I placed each document in my briefcase. These papers represented more than money. They were proof of trust betrayed, promises broken, gratitude discarded like yesterday's newspaper. $20,000 that had meant everything to us, nothing to him now. The desk lamp's warm glow suddenly felt oppressive. I switched it off, plunging the desk into harsh fluorescent light that cast sharp shadows across the remaining boxes. The transition felt symbolic, from nostalgic warmth to cold reality, from father to adversary. But as I continued packing under the unforgiving overhead lights, something crystallized in my chest. This wasn't just about money or gratitude anymore. This was about a man who had forgotten where he came from, who treated loyalty like a commodity to be discarded when convenient. Douglas had started a game today. Soon he would learn that his father still remembered how to play. Working through my desk drawers had become mechanical, efficient, each opened compartment revealing another chapter of my professional life, ready for boxing. The bottom drawer, however, refused to budge. Years of disuse had warped the wood, and I pulled repeatedly until it suddenly lurched open with a sharp crack. Files I didn't recognize spilled across the floor, documents marked with Douglas's initials, papers that clearly belonged in the CEO's office, not mine. Perhaps they'd been stored here temporarily during some reorganization, forgotten in the chaos of quarterly reports and board meetings. The first document appeared routine, an internal financial summary for Q4 2024, but the numbers made me pause. According to my memory, our profit margins had been strong, but not exceptional. These figures showed something different entirely, projections that seemed impossibly optimistic for our market position. I spread the papers across my cleared desk, adjusting my reading glasses under the harsh fluorescent lights. The second document revealed clear discrepancies with the public financial reports I'd reviewed just hours earlier. Where our published statements showed modest growth, these internal documents claimed explosive profitability. "What is this?" I whispered, holding up a handwritten note in Douglas's familiar scrawl. "Profit margins increased by $1 million?" My phone came out instinctively, fingers navigating to the publicly filed quarterly reports. The contrast was stark, undeniable. Our official SEC filing claimed $2.3 million in quarterly profits. These internal documents projected $3.4 million to potential investors. "Douglas, what have you done?" The third document contained detailed breakdowns of investor presentations, carefully crafted narratives designed to paint Grant FinTech as more profitable than reality suggested. Margin calculations had been artificially inflated, debt obligations minimized, growth projections stretched beyond any reasonable expectation. This wasn't creative accounting. This was systematic fraud. I checked the hallway nervously before returning to the documents, my business instincts screaming warnings I should have recognized earlier. The camera mounted at the corridor intersection seemed to watch with electronic indifference as I photographed each page with trembling hands. Douglas's handwritten notes revealed the scope of his deception. Emphasize Q4 growth trajectory. Minimize debt-to-equity discussion. Focus on projected revenues, not current reality. Each annotation was a deliberate step away from truth, toward the kind of financial manipulation that destroyed companies and sent executives to prison. This isn't creative accounting. This is fraud. The words tasted bitter, spoken aloud in the empty office where I'd spent 2 decades building legitimate success. The final document was a timeline, Douglas's plan for securing major investment capital based on these inflated projections. He intended to present this fabricated financial picture to institutional investors within weeks, potentially securing millions in funding based on lies. My son wasn't just arrogant and ungrateful. He was a criminal, systematically deceiving investors while building his empire on foundations of fraud. The young man who had once sobbed gratefully in our kitchen had become someone I didn't recognize, someone willing to destroy innocent investors to feed his ambition. I secured each document carefully in my briefcase, beside the 2008 papers that told such a different story. The contrast was overwhelming. Then, a desperate son seeking help from his father. Now, a criminal son who had forgotten the difference between ambition and theft. Standing in my office doorway, I looked down the darkened hallway toward Douglas's distant office. The moral decision had crystallized with shocking clarity. This wasn't about family loyalty anymore. This was about right and wrong, about protecting innocent investors from my son's greed. The hallway stretched before me as I walked purposefully toward the elevator bank, briefcase in one hand, a small box of personal items in the other. My footsteps echoed against marble floors in the nearly empty building, each step carrying me further from 20 years of my life, and closer to an uncertain future I was only beginning to understand. Douglas's office door opened unexpectedly ahead of me, stopping me mid-stride. He emerged carrying files for what I assumed were weekend meetings, his tailored suit still pristine despite the long day. Neither of us had planned this encounter, but his presence felt inevitable. One final confrontation before I left this building forever. He stepped directly into my path, blocking easy passage to the elevators. I stopped respectfully, but didn't step aside, maintaining the dignity that had carried me through 40 years of business dealings. His eyes flicked to the box in my arms with cold satisfaction, as if my packed belongings confirmed his victory. Douglas glanced at his expensive watch with theatrical impatience, a gesture designed to remind me of my new status as an unwelcome intruder in what had once been my professional home. "Dad, I need you gone in 5 minutes. Security is locking down the building." "Understood. And don't forget to turn in your company car keys." His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to wielding power over others. "The Lexus needs to be in the parking garage by Monday morning." The car. 20 years of service, and he wanted to reclaim even that small courtesy. I shifted my briefcase to a more secure grip, feeling the weight of the documents inside, evidence that would reshape our relationship permanently once I decided to use it. Douglas turned away dismissively, expecting compliance without question. His confident stride carried him toward the executive wing, where he would spend the weekend preparing presentations based on fraudulent financial data. He moved like a man who had never faced real consequences, who believed his position insulated him from accountability. "Very well, son, let's play by your rules." My words were spoken quietly, almost to myself, but they carried the weight of a declaration of war. Douglas disappeared around the corner, unaware that his father's capitulation was theatrical, temporary. He had pushed beyond the boundaries of business conflict into personal cruelty, and that final insult about the car had crossed a line I hadn't known existed. I pulled out my phone as I continued toward the elevators, scrolling through contacts until I found Gordon Hale's number. My lawyer, my old friend, someone who understood both business law and the complexities of family betrayal. The phone felt heavy in my hand, loaded with potential consequences that would change everything. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, its polished doors reflecting my determined expression. As I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor, I felt the weight of transformation settling around me like new clothes. I was no longer Columbus Grant, the dismissed father seeking sympathy. I was Columbus Grant, the businessman with evidence of criminal fraud, preparing to teach his son that respect isn't optional and consequences aren't negotiable. The elevator descended smoothly, carrying me toward a future where family loyalty would take second place to justice. Gordon's contact information glowed on my phone screen as the elevator doors closed. Time to make the call that would change everything. Gordon's law office felt like a sanctuary of old-world professionalism as I entered Monday morning, carrying my briefcase with the photographed evidence that would change everything. Heavy wooden furniture and leather-bound legal volumes lined mahogany shelves, while morning sunlight streamed through tall windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. The weight of tradition and justice filled this space, making it the perfect venue for what I had to do. "Columbus, close the door and have a seat." Gordon's greeting carried none of our usual pleasantries. My Sunday evening call had clearly prepared him for something serious, though he couldn't have imagined the scope of what I'd discovered. I placed the printed photographs across his leather-inlaid desk without ceremony. "Gordon, I need you to review these confidential materials and tell me what legal options we have." He adjusted his reading glasses and began examining each document with the methodical precision that had made him one of Chicago's most respected corporate attorneys. His expression grew increasingly grave as he studied Douglas's handwritten notes, the inflated profit projections, the systematic deception designed to mislead potential investors. "Columbus, these are serious allegations. Are you certain about this?" His voice carried the weight of someone who understood federal criminal law. "Gordon, I worked in finance for 40 years. I know fraud when I see it." The documents spoke for themselves. Internal reports showing one set of numbers, while SEC filings showed completely different figures. Investor presentations built on fabricated financial data. Gordon pulled several legal reference books from his shelves, cross-referencing securities regulations with what we'd uncovered. His computer screen filled with federal statutes as he verified current SEC requirements for financial disclosure. The systematic nature of Douglas's deception became clearer with each legal standard we reviewed. This constitutes federal securities fraud, Columbus. The SEC and FBI would handle this. He made detailed notes on his legal pad, organizing potential charges and evidence requirements. The penalties are severe: significant prison time, massive fines, permanent disbarment from corporate leadership. What do I need to do? First, we file an anonymous whistleblower complaint with the SEC. Then, depending on their response, you might need to cooperate with a federal investigation. Gordon secured copies of the evidence in his office safe, following proper legal protocols. There are strong whistleblower protections, but this will likely require your testimony if charges are filed. He explained the investigation timeline. Federal agencies move deliberately but thoroughly when presented with clear evidence of securities fraud. The process could take weeks or months, but Douglas's systematic deception provided exactly the kind of documentation prosecutors needed for successful convictions. You understand this will destroy his career permanently? Gordon's question carried the weight of friendship, legal advice, and recognition of the family implications. Once federal charges are filed, there's no going back. I thought of Eleanor's worried face, of the young man who had once sobbed gratefully in our kitchen, of the arrogant executive who had publicly humiliated me days earlier. The evidence spread across Gordon's desk told the story of a son who had forgotten the difference between ambition and criminality. Schedule the meeting with the FBI, Gordon. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Tuesday afternoon found me navigating federal building security with the nervous precision of someone entering unfamiliar territory. Metal detectors, ID verification, and badge-wearing guards created an atmosphere of institutional authority that made my mission feel both official and irreversible. Agent Ramirez had scheduled our meeting for 2 p.m. after reviewing my preliminary complaint filed that morning. The FBI field office occupied several floors of the federal building, its standard government furniture and American flag creating an environment of serious purpose. Agent Ramirez, a woman in her mid-40s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to complex financial crimes, escorted me to an interview room equipped with recording equipment. Mr. Grant, I want to explain our procedures before we begin. Her professional tone carried no judgment, only methodical thoroughness. This interview will be recorded, and you have the right to have your attorney present. You're here voluntarily to provide information about potential federal crimes. I nodded my understanding, having discussed these procedures with Gordon the previous day. The manila folder containing my evidence sat between us like a bridge, between suspicion and proof, between family loyalty and criminal justice. These are serious allegations against your son, Mr. Grant. I need you to walk me through exactly how you discovered this evidence. Agent Ramirez, the facts speak for themselves. I opened the folder and began systematic presentation of each document, explaining the context of discovery, while she photographed and cataloged every piece of evidence. The inflated profit projections, the falsified investor presentations, the handwritten notes documenting deliberate deception. Each item added weight to the federal case. She questioned me thoroughly about my background, my relationship with Douglas, my knowledge of Grant FinTech's operations. My 40 years of business experience provided credibility, while my personal investment in the company's 2008 survival established both motive and opportunity for discovering the fraud. We'll need time for independent verification of these allegations. Agent Ramirez secured the original documents in evidence bags, following federal chain of custody protocols. During our investigation, you cannot contact the subject or discuss this matter with anyone except your attorney. Understood. I'm prepared for full cooperation. She explained the investigation timeline. Federal agencies would verify the authenticity of the documents, cross-reference with SEC filings, potentially interview other company employees. If the evidence supported criminal charges, Douglas would be arrested and face federal prosecution for securities fraud. Are you prepared to testify in federal court if this case goes to trial? Her question carried the weight of final commitment, the understanding that my cooperation would make me a key witness in my son's potential conviction. The recording equipment hummed softly as I signed the formal witness statement and cooperation agreement. Each signature marked another step away from family loyalty toward federal justice. But Douglas's systematic deception of innocent investors demanded accountability that transcended personal relationships. Walking out of the federal building an hour later, I carried Agent Ramirez's business card and a copy of my witness statement. The weight of institutional authority followed me to the parking garage, where I sat in my car for several minutes, processing what I'd just initiated. Looking back at the federal building's imposing facade, I understood there was no retreat from this path. Douglas had chosen deception over integrity, and federal justice would provide the education I'd failed to give him. Monday morning at 7 sharp, I sat in my car across from the Grant FinTech building, watching unmarked federal vehicles position themselves around the glass tower that had once represented our family's shared ambitions. Agent Ramirez had called Sunday evening to inform me that federal warrants had been secured and the arrest would proceed at morning rush hour. FBI agents in tactical gear emerged from black SUVs with military precision, their movements coordinated by radio communication and years of experience executing federal operations. The sight of federal law enforcement preparing to arrest my son created a complex mixture of vindication and parental anguish that I hadn't anticipated. Douglas's silver BMW pulled into the executive parking area at exactly 7:15, his punctuality serving him poorly for once. He emerged carrying files for investor meetings scheduled throughout the week, completely unaware that federal agents were already securing the building's entrances and elevator banks. The lobby filled with federal agents as Douglas approached the main entrance, their presence creating a controlled chaos that immediately altered the building's morning routine. Office workers arriving for normal Monday business found themselves redirected by agents maintaining perimeter security around what had become a federal crime scene. Agent Ramirez positioned herself near the elevator bank as Douglas entered the lobby, his confident stride carrying him directly toward the confrontation that would end his criminal enterprise permanently. The federal operation unfolded with mechanical efficiency. No drama, no excessive force, just professional law enforcement executing legal warrants. Douglas Grant, you're under arrest for federal securities fraud. Agent Ramirez's voice carried clearly across the marble lobby as she displayed her credentials and arrest warrant. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in federal court. This is a mistake. Call my lawyer immediately. Douglas's voice cracked with disbelief as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The arrogant executive who had publicly humiliated me 10 days earlier now faced federal criminal charges based on evidence I'd provided. Mia Torres emerged from the elevator bank with other early arriving staff members, her face showing genuine shock at the federal operation unfolding in their workplace. What's happening here? Where is Mr. Columbus? Her loyalty to me, even in chaos, provided unexpected comfort. Federal investigation into financial fraud, ma'am? The agent's response was professional, final, offering no additional details about ongoing criminal proceedings. FBI agents simultaneously secured the Grant FinTech offices, seizing computers and financial records that would provide additional evidence of Douglas's systematic deception. The methodical nature of federal evidence collection transformed our former workplace into a documented crime scene. From my distant vantage point, I watched Douglas being escorted through the lobby in handcuffs, his expensive suit and confident demeanor replaced by the reality of federal criminal prosecution. The perp walk through the building's glass entrance would likely appear on evening news broadcasts, completing his public humiliation. Media vans began arriving as word spread about the federal operation, their cameras capturing the arrest of a prominent Chicago businessman for securities fraud. The story would dominate financial news for days, a cautionary tale about corporate greed and the long reach of federal justice. As Douglas disappeared into a federal transport vehicle, I started my car and drove slowly away from the scene. Justice had been served, but watching my son's arrest created emotional complexity I hadn't expected. The vindication felt hollow, overshadowed by the recognition that our family would never recover from this morning's events. Agent Ramirez's investigation had moved swiftly from evidence review to arrest warrant, proving that Douglas's arrogance had finally encountered consequences he couldn't manipulate or dismiss. The federal system had no tolerance for securities fraud, regardless of family connections or executive privilege. 2 months had passed since Douglas's arrest when I walked through the federal courthouse metal detectors for what would become the most difficult day of my life. My footsteps echoed against marble floors as armed marshals directed me toward courtroom 415, where I would testify against my own son in federal criminal proceedings. The courtroom's dark wood paneling and formal atmosphere created a sense of institutional gravity that made family relationships seem secondary to justice. Douglas sat at the defendant's table in an orange prison jumpsuit, his expensive suits and corporate confidence replaced by the reality of federal detention. Eleanor occupied a seat in the gallery behind me, dressed formally but carrying the weight of a mother watching her family destroy itself. "Please raise your right hand." The court clerk's words carried finality as I approached the witness stand. The oath felt heavier than usual, knowing I was swearing to tell the truth about my son's criminal activities before a jury of 12 citizens who would decide his fate. "Mr. Grant, how did you discover these documents?" The prosecutor's first question launched me into testimony I'd rehearsed for weeks with federal attorneys. I was packing my belongings after being terminated and found them in my desk drawer. My voice remained steady as I explained the timeline of discovery, the systematic nature of Douglas's fraud, the fabricated investor presentations designed to deceive innocent people seeking legitimate investment opportunities. The defense attorney's cross-examination attacked my motives with calculated aggression. "You sought revenge against your son for firing you, didn't you, Mr. Grant?" I protected investors from securities fraud. Each question tested my resolve, but 40 years of business experience had taught me to separate emotion from fact, personal pain from professional responsibility. Douglas stared at me throughout the testimony, his expression mixing disbelief with betrayal. The young man who had once begged for my help now watched his father provide evidence that would send him to federal prison. Eleanor dabbed at her eyes with tissues, grieving for both her husband's pain and her son's choices. The jury deliberated for 3 hours while I waited in the courthouse hallway, processing the complexity of having testified against my own child. When they returned, their faces carried the weight of a decision that would reshape multiple lives permanently. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Morrison's question echoed through the silent courtroom. "We have, Your Honor." The foreman's voice was clear, decisive. "On all counts of securities fraud, conspiracy, and wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty." Douglas's face crumpled as the verdict registered. His attorney placed a steadying hand on his shoulder while marshals prepared to escort him back to detention. Eleanor's quiet sobs filled the courtroom's silence, but she made no move to comfort the son who had brought this upon himself. Walking past reporters shouting questions outside the courthouse, I maintained the dignity that had carried me through this ordeal. Gordon waited beside his car, ready to drive me away from the scene where justice had finally been served, though the price had proven higher than any of us anticipated. The federal system had spoken. My son was officially a convicted criminal, and I was the witness who had made it possible. The sentencing hearing in July felt different from the trial, more solemn, final, carrying the weight of consequences that couldn't be appealed or overturned. Judge Morrison reviewed pre-sentence reports, while Douglas stood in shackles, noticeably thinner after 3 months in federal detention, his arrogance finally broken by the reality of his situation. 7 years federal prison, restitution of $2.3 million to defrauded investors. Judge Morrison's sentence echoed through the courtroom with mechanical precision. The defendant will surrender all assets and forfeit his corporate positions permanently. Marshall led Douglas away without a backward glance at Eleanor or me. His wife exited the courthouse immediately, refusing to speak to reporters who shouted questions about divorce proceedings and custody arrangements. The family I'd known for 42 years had officially ceased to exist. Driving past Douglas's former mansion that afternoon, I saw the sold sign planted firmly in the manicured lawn. Real estate agents had liquidated his assets to satisfy federal restitution requirements. The house, cars, investment portfolios, everything accumulated during his fraudulent success now belonged to his victims. Eleanor met me at our kitchen table that evening, her face showing the exhaustion of watching our son's complete destruction. "Was it worth losing him forever?" she asked, though her tone carried acceptance rather than accusation. "Justice has been served," I replied, though the words felt inadequate for the complexity of our situation. Meanwhile, Douglas adapted to federal prison routines in his concrete cell, sharing space with a roommate who listened to his bitter complaints about family betrayal. The corporate executive who had once commanded boardrooms now stood in cafeteria lines and followed guards' orders, learning lessons about respect and consequences that came 20 years too late. His children learned they couldn't visit Daddy in his new home. Their mother, filing divorce papers with systematic efficiency, explained that Daddy had made very bad choices and would be away for a long time. The grandchildren I might never see again became casualties of their father's criminal arrogance. News coverage gradually faded, but the business community remembered the Grant fintech scandal as a cautionary tale about family businesses and executive oversight. My name appeared in articles as the whistleblower father who chose justice over family loyalty, a role I'd never wanted but couldn't avoid. Federal prison records listed Douglas Grant, inmate number 47821, serving 7 years for securities fraud. His cell contained a narrow bed, small desk, and toilet, a dramatic reduction from the executive suite where he'd orchestrated his crimes. The man who had once fired his father now depended on federal correctional officers for basic privileges. Lying in my own bed that night, I reflected on the journey from public humiliation to federal witness. Eleanor slept peacefully beside me, having made peace with our choices and their consequences. Douglas's arrogance had cost him everything, while my principles had ultimately protected hundreds of innocent investors from financial ruin. The price of justice had proven higher than anticipated, but some lessons could only be learned through consequences that couldn't be negotiated, appealed, or dismissed. Federal prison would provide Douglas with 7 years to contemplate the difference between ambition and criminality. August evening light filtered through our backyard garden as I arranged chairs for the gathering Gordon had suggested. A quiet celebration of vindication among friends who had believed in my integrity throughout the ordeal. Eleanor moved efficiently between kitchen and patio, preparing food with the satisfaction of a woman whose husband had been publicly exonerated. String lights hung between mature oak trees created a warm atmosphere that felt like normal life, returning after months of federal proceedings and family trauma. Citronella candles provided protection from mosquitoes, while casting gentle shadows across our modest but well-maintained property in Oak Park. Gordon arrived with his wife, carrying champagne and wearing the satisfied expression of an attorney whose client had achieved complete vindication. Former colleagues who had initially doubted my allegations now offered handshakes and congratulations, their respect restored by federal court proceedings that had proven every accusation accurate. "You saved hundreds of investors from losing their retirement savings," Gordon announced during his toast, raising his glass toward the evening sky. "That required courage most people don't possess." Eleanor stood beside me with genuine pride, her hand resting lightly on my arm as friends acknowledged the personal cost of my decision to cooperate with federal authorities. The woman who had worried about using our savings in 2008 now celebrated her husband's willingness to sacrifice family relationships for principle. Justice sometimes comes late, but it comes. My response to Gordon's toast carried the weight of experience, loss, and hard-won wisdom about the price of integrity in family relationships. As guests gradually departed, Eleanor and I cleaned up together with the comfortable efficiency of a couple who had weathered an unexpected storm and emerged stronger. The evening had provided closure to a chapter that began with professional humiliation and ended with moral vindication. Sitting in our garden chairs as stars emerged overhead, we reflected on the journey from Douglas's corporate coup to federal conviction. The cost had been enormous: a son lost, grandchildren estranged, family relationships destroyed permanently. But the alternative had been complicity in crimes that would have devastated innocent investors. "I'm proud of you," Eleanor said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had watched her husband choose difficult integrity over convenient family loyalty. You did the right thing, regardless of the price. The truth had indeed been worth everything it cost. Douglas's fraudulent success had been built on foundations of deception that would have eventually collapsed, taking hundreds of investors with him. My intervention had protected those innocent people while teaching my son that respect and honesty weren't optional, even in family relationships. Federal prison would provide Douglas with 7 years to consider the difference between legitimate achievement and criminal enterprise. Perhaps someday the grandchildren would understand that their grandfather had chosen principle over family comfort, justice over personal convenience. Tonight, under stars that had witnessed both our greatest family triumph and its most devastating failure, Eleanor and I sat together in the peace that comes from knowing we had acted with integrity when integrity mattered most. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.